Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Paul Dalgarno all the way from Melbourne to talk about his novel A Country of Eternal Light. Hello Paul.
Hi Alistair, good to see you.
And you. And before we get into the details of the novel, how do you describe it to people? Because it's a very certainly the way it's told is really interesting and unusual.
Well, the main character of this novel is called Margaret Bryce, and the title, the working title that it went to the publisher with was Margaret Bryce's Post-Life Crisis. And in a way that kind of describes the book. So Margaret died in 2014. She's a working class woman from Aberdeen with two, by the time she dies, twin daughters. And she's narrating the novel from sometime in the early 2020s, round about now. And she's revisiting parts of her life out of sequence. And it's not so much that she is recalling them, she's literally revisiting them. So in some scenes, we have a living Margaret and dead Margaret sharing the stage, as it were. She's particularly, there's a time in 2014 where her daughters, who have been estranged since kind of just before their teens, pre-teens, come back together, as it were, in Aberdeen. One of them's moved off to Australia, like I did. One of them's moved off to Spain, and the idea is that they've come back in 2014 because they know their mum's dying. She's been sick for a couple of years, and they spend like 3 weeks together trying to keep the peace between everyone. So that's a particular point of focus, but also it goes back to Margaret's childhood, to times with her husband Henry, who, you know, we see the trajectory of their marriage from quite a, perfectly serviceable marriage to definitely a more strained relationship in the last years of Margaret's life. And yeah, times with her friends, times at work, times with her parents when she was a younger girl. So we kind of travel out of sequence with Margaret. And
where did the idea of telling the story as you have done come from? That kind of, as you say, out of sequence, the having Margaret kind of overseeing the past, present in the way that you do.
Yeah, well, one of the earliest thoughts in this book really was that I wanted to somehow cover grief, but more as an experience rather than, grief. You'll be familiar with it. I'm fairly certain, and anybody listening to this will be familiar with it or will be at some point. And really, I was interested in that experience of when you're grieving, normal chronology goes out of the window. It's a bit like the week between Christmas and New Year, where it's just a kind of weird time soup where things present themselves, not necessarily in the way you might imagine. So not, these grand Shakespearean moments in your life where people said, "I'm proud of you, son or daughter," etc. But just in a way, kind of calcified bits of your life come floating up to the surface and present themselves in the way they want to. So that was quite an early idea in the book, and I just thought, well, that's one way to tell the story, to just throw chronology out of the window, or I should say throw standard chronology out of the window, because the trick, of course, is there's nothing more annoying than reading something and it keeps jumping about all over the place. So there is a danger with that structure. But the challenge, which I got really into while I was writing it, was actually keeping the story moving forward the whole way through. So it doesn't really matter where you are in terms of chronology, as long as the story, the heart of the story, keeps moving forwards and keeps kind of answering and asking questions in the right order.
And I think why that works so well is because Margaret is herself asking almost, where are we now? What's this memory, or not memory? What's this event that I'm kind of witnessing now? What time is it?
Yeah.
She contextualizes it for herself, so you're getting it also.
I think that's right. And, the novel, the previous books I've written have all been in the simple past tense, which seems to be the kind of go-to for novels. And this one's written in the present tense, and it's to give it that sense of immediacy. So as you say, Margaret's encountering these things, they're happening for her now, whether or not they happened originally in, the 1950s, as far as she's concerned as a character in her post-life state, she's coming upon them, and she'll remind herself. She'll say, right, I think I know where we are. This is the day that this happened or that happened. But she's her nose is up against it. She's up against the surface of what's happening, and it's unfolding in real time for her.
And another way you do that is, although it's mainly about Margaret and her family, there's a lot of history in there as well. You've got these significant events which kind of puncture throughout the book.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, for the last book I wrote, one of the editor's comments when it was in that kind of back and forth state was that I should do a detailed timeline for it, which I'd never done before, and I did. And you know, without really going into it, that book had a fairly straightforward chronology. It kind of started, and 3 months later it finished, really. But doing the timeline really helped and revealed lots of things to me that, you know, in your head as a writer, you're just like, oh, a bit of time has passed. But then when you actually map it to a calendar, you're like, right, okay, so that actually 6 days would have passed by here. It's not, you know, we're not talking a vague kind of couple of weeks or whatever. And so for this one, but I mean, because I knew it was going to be in this kind of jumping around kind of way, I had to do a much more detailed timeline. And you know, even simple things like all the characters' ages, we're all 2 different ages every year. So it's not enough to just be like, well, it was 1975, they must have been 20. You kind of need to know when somebody's birthday is, you know, when they got married, when their parents died, when they bought their dog, how old the dog would be 3 years later. And as part of that, really bringing in what would have been happening in the world, the kind of things people would have been talking about. So, you know, the death of Princess Diana is one of those kind of Twin Towers moments that I think most of us can remember being quite shocked by that happening, and almost shocked by the shock. I certainly was. You know, it's not like you wander through life thinking, I'd be really shocked if Princess Diana died. But these things can just catch you. And likewise, the summer of 1988 is a bit of a kind of critical one in the book, and that's the summer that the Piper Alpha disaster happened in Aberdeen. I'm from Aberdeen, but I think even if you were anywhere in Scotland and potentially in the UK, you were old enough to be watching the news at that time. That was another one of those events that you couldn't quite believe was happening.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it makes you realize that as life unfolds on a day-to-day basis, there are often certain events that puncture through that. And I suppose you would say a JFK moment, you know, that kind of, you know where you were or when you heard the news of those things. And it's interesting hearing you talking about all that work going into how old the dog is, when birthdays are. That really pays off, because there's nothing, as I read it, that tripped me up. That, you know, something, oh, well, hang on a minute, if that was there and that was, it just really goes smoothly. That, in fact, I never questioned it, but it sounds like it's interesting to a non-writer to hear about that kind of work that goes on in the background. It's almost like the kind of research that you might do into a book, which is never actually makes the page, but is vital.
Yeah, I mean, that's lovely to hear, Alistair. I mean, that's kind of what you're hoping. I think it's, you know, lots of writings like that, you know, as soon as you kind of trip over a sentence and have to go back and read a sentence for any number of reasons, you know, a kind of, usually it's like an overambitious metaphor. I used to edit in Scotland, actually, at the Sunday Herald, and I'd do music reviews, and you'd get these lines like, oh, it's like, you know, a really common kind of structure was, if Iggy Pop had a kid with Tori Amos and blah, blah. And those kind of things, you kind of get what somebody's saying, of course, but it also makes you stop and think, hang on, what does that mean? Or, you know, it's like a monkey on speed or something. And you're like, you know, anything that kind of pulls you out and draws attention to itself is actually, it's kind of showy writing, and sometimes it can work. Yeah. But really what you're trying to do is not let people see what you're doing, because you don't really want people to see the words. I mean, ultimately, it's a bit of it's a weird thing. We're talking about symbols printed on a bit of paper, and what you're trying to do is conjure something in somebody's head where they're not thinking about the fact they're looking at symbols on a bit of paper. So yeah, I'm kind of interested looking at writers' careers over time, and very few writers get more showy as they go along, or more obviously showy. What they tend to do is just get better and simpler. Similarly with musicians, you can't even pick why some great session drummer that's been around for 40 years, why his kind of fairly standard beat sounds better than everyone else's. And it's because he or she or they have mastered something simple and fundamental that's not drawing attention to itself, other than in the fact you think it's good.
Yeah, they've done away with the Cozy Powell drum solos and just
exactly, yeah.
And I think that's something. Those kind of what you're saying. Sometimes you'll write a sentence or you'll write something you think, I'm really pleased with that, but it just doesn't fit in that at the time. So the best thing to do is probably, admire it and then let it go.
Yeah, and my style has always been to overwrite. So as a journalist, you work to word counts. So if you're given a 600-word story, my process has always been write 900 words as quickly as I can, because then I can cut 300. And that's always been the way. I think if you're kind of trying to fill the space, then you start getting panicky about pulling away any of the scaffolding. But the fun part for me is just kind of pulling out all the stuff that's not working, and there's plenty that doesn't work. And ultimately, I remember before I'd written a book, just going into bookshops or picking up a book and feeling so intimidated because books came out of the gate so strong. It'd be like, oh my god, this writer's amazing. And I still don't know that much about other writers' processes, but I do know that very few writers, Muriel Spark probably being a kind of notable exception, but very few writers sit down and what they write off the bat is how the piece ends up. There's a lot of work and revision and pulling stuff out to just leave the stuff that's your best stuff.
And often your relationship with an editor is kind of crucial at that point as well, I guess.
Yeah, it is. But I've always, since my days, feature writing in Glasgow, I've always I'm an editor. That's my day job. So I have nothing but respect for editors, and I know the value an editor can bring to a piece of work. But personally, I don't want my work to be heavily edited. And if it needs it, I will take it, and any feedback that's given, I always take. I don't think anybody's wrong when they say, oh, I didn't really understand that bit. You kind of know, right, something's not working. But my preference is to try and get things so I'm as sure as I can be that there's not a problem with it before the editor sees it. Because quite quickly, you can get into a situation where you've got 8 million track changes to look through rather than 20, which is like a lot more manageable.
That's really interesting. I know some writers will have, say, 150,000 words, and it needs to be nearer 80,000 or something like that. And that's something that's worked with an editor. But what you do is you get it down to where you think it should be.
Yeah,
almost to this as close to a finished book as you could. Is that right?
Yeah, like if they said, look, it needs to be 80,000 words on the nose, I would file 79,999. And then they'd be like, we still need that extra word. I'd much rather do it that way around. But because I kind of feel I'd just rather be in control of that part, the editing part. I can always write more and I can always take stuff out. So I find it a little bit, basically something I want to avoid somebody else taking out, like in the scenario you mentioned, somebody taking 70,000 words out of your 150, to me is just a bit too much, handing over your life support to someone else,
Yeah. It's interesting how different every writer is in the process that how they work, I guess.
Yeah.
Going back to the novel, I kind of read it in part as a ghost story, but a kind of natural ghost story. Is that fair? A fair kind of description?
Yeah, I think it is a fair description. But what do you mean by natural, though? I like the sound of that.
Not a supernatural ghost story. Not like it seemed natural to me. Not that there was a haunting going on, or that there was anything necessarily gothic or horrific. It seemed quite natural that this is what has happened to Margaret, and that she is viewing her life, this way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description, and forgive me because I'm going to steal it, and you might hear it in the future sometime. Me describing it as a natural ghost story.
Feel free.
Yeah, but when I was writing it, talking about this idea of grief, there's a particular type of grief psychologists call complicated grief, which is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, all grief is complicated, but it basically comes from not being there when somebody passes, when somebody dies. And it's just that kind of Schrodinger's cat thing that happens to the people left behind, where if they haven't seen the body and they haven't, gone through the funeral or other rites of passage, the person somehow is still alive in their head, even though they know they're not. So it's a weird kind of, you're not delusional, but you keep catching yourself, having to remind yourself that the person's dead, which I think is true actually of lots of types of grief. But so what I was interested in trying to do in the case of Margaret was just create a character who had both of those things. She was dead and alive. So, one of the regular things I've heard about Margaret from other people is that she's a very embodied character, which I take as a huge compliment, but it's also a funny irony because Margaret spends the whole book reflecting on the fact she doesn't have a body.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think it's, rather than, I mean, she is a ghost by kind of definition. She's dead and she's still around. But certainly my kind of working idea of Margaret was that she was simply a character who was both dead and alive at the same time.
So you never thought, you're writing in a tradition of the Gothic or supernatural or anything like that? It doesn't feel like that.
Not really. I mean, there is. I mean, the title of the book is taken from Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is woven all the way through. It's kind of, I guess, like a bit of an intertext with the novel. So, I mean, not that Frankenstein's a ghost story, but you mentioned the Gothic, and so there is a kind of a little bit of a back and forth going on with the Gothic, but I wasn't. I wasn't writing in that tradition, if you like, of the great ghost stories.
And also important in the book is place. You've got Margaret's early days in Aberdeenshire, and then you've got the visit to family in Australia, which is particularly memorable. How important is that to you when writing? Do you need to have a strong sense of where things are happening, where events are taking place?
With my last book, I actually had this, it was a book called Polly, that wasn't published in the UK, but I actually had this idea that I wasn't going to set it anywhere, like it was just going to be in an unnamed place. And I ended up setting it in Melbourne, and Melbourne kind of essentially became one of the characters in the novel. For this one, what really happened was... So this was my third book to be published. The first book I published in 2015. The publisher went out of business about 2 weeks before the book came out. So it just, I think it had one Facebook post and then crashed and, burned. I completely lost heart. I really had to try and pick myself back up to even give another book a crack. Wrote my second book, got another publisher, which I was surprised and happy about. And it was all, we've made hundreds of tote bags. This is going to be our kind of book of the year, etc. And it was due to come out in June 2020. So there's all that waiting, and then COVID happened. And the publisher said, "Oh, well, we'll push it back a little bit. We'll push it back to September when, this will all have blown over," kind of thing. A bit like those young men you see in films who are rushing to get to the front lines before the war's over, and 4 years still of war to go. So it came out in September, at which point, Melbourne holds the record for the most lockdown place on earth during that period. Right. So we were in a lockdown at that point that stretched for a really long time. Like everything had been closed for a couple of months, and everything was closed for a couple of months afterwards. And there was a curfew, and there was a radius you couldn't go beyond. Like you couldn't go more than 5 kilometers from your house. Anyway, that book obviously didn't perform as well as they expected because there were no bookshops open. And that publisher got in touch to say they were dropping all their normal authors. They were continuing with a kind of boutique publishing model, but none of their kind of literature writers. And what that meant was I was now 2 books in, 2 major bouts of just like regret about my life into it as well. And just like, you know, I can't bloody sell a book to save my life here. And in that period, I remember just thinking, like I'd probably not put myself through that again. And also thinking nobody would ever pick up another book by me because it's like the kiss of death, clearly. And what happened was I just eventually realized, which is a weird thing to say, but realized that I'm actually a Scottish writer, that I don't have to be, like I said, the last book was completely set in Melbourne, and that's where I've been living for years now. And realized that I didn't need to be limited by that, because the chances of me being published again anyway by anybody were so incredibly slim in my mind, and the chances of failure almost guaranteed, that I thought I can just really forget about any kind of market. Like I don't have an audience clamoring for my next book here, or even a publisher, so I can write whatever I want to write. And in this case, probably partially because we had been locked down and I was feeling quite kind of cut off from, you know, where I'm from and friends and family and things, it just seemed very natural and obvious and comfortable for me to write about Scotland. I mean, there's bits in Edinburgh. I think Glasgow's mentioned in there, but it's basically in Aberdeen, which again, you know, amazingly, given it's you know, Scotland's 3rd city, there aren't a huge amount of literary books set in Aberdeen. So in a way, it was like, you know, probably what it felt like being the Beatles in 1963 or Buddy Holly 10 years earlier. You know, it's like, oh, there's a bit of a clear playing field. I mean, I'm not saying there are books set in Aberdeen, of course, but it didn't feel oversaturated in the way that you know, I imagine it might, trying to write the great Glasgow novel. There are so many good ones from there, and the great Edinburgh novel.
And being as far away as you are, does that make you reflect on your times, not just Scotland itself, but your time spent there as well? Is that something that you think distance does?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, there's a couple of things there. I think you have to be kind of a little bit careful as the expat that you know, that you don't kind of well, you have left a bit of a time bubble, because even if you go back, you're only going back for a couple of weeks at a time, and you're not actually living. So I jokingly said to people when I left my job in Scotland in 2010, before I said I was leaving, I said, oh, I'm going to leave if David Cameron gets in to power, you know. And then he got into power, and I was like, you know, I'm emigrating, you know, which I was going to be doing anyway. My wife's from Melbourne, that's why we came here. And but that's like, a lot has happened. I mean, the entire Tory, what's it, 13 years now, 14 years, you know, austerity, Brexit, the 2014 referendum, and post referendum, and what's going on now. So I think you have to be quite careful as that person overseas, that you're not just kind of telling people, oh, this is how things are in Scotland, you know, we all do this and we all do that. And this time, just like last month, going back over to Scotland, and particularly going up to Aberdeen, I was like, holy shit, this place has really changed. It's like really, really different to how I remember it. So there's definitely that aspect of not wanting to be the kind of, you know, romanticizing expat. But I think there's the other side of kind of realizing, because, you know, if I'd moved to somewhere like France or Dubai or something, I imagine that every single day I'd be out in the world saying, you know, I'm clearly somewhere foreign. You know, people talk a different language, the food's completely different, etc. But coming to another Anglo country like Australia, you don't have that every day, but you do have quite a lot of instances where you just realize that your cultural signifiers aren't the same. And they almost take you more by surprise, because otherwise it's just like you're just somewhere, people talk English, you know, the weather is arguably better sometimes. So there are lots of reminders that I'm kind of born and bred Scottish. And, you know, funnily, Teddy Jameson, who's a very, very good writer, you know, wrote for the Herald for many years, came to my book launch in Edinburgh. And his question at the end of the Q&A thing was, do you consider yourself an Australian writer or a Scottish writer? And to me, it would seem like a massive overreach to call myself an Australian writer, and like almost a no-brainer to call myself a Scottish writer, because the sensibility of me in all my formative years and right into my 30s was formed from living in Scotland.
Do you think that would still have been the case if you hadn't had the misfortune of the first two novels? The COVID year.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, do you think you still would feel, no, I'm a Scottish writer?
I think so. That there's a kind of I kind of feel like on quite safe ground, because I wrote columns and features and all the rest of it when I was working in Glasgow. I kind of I kind of felt pretty safe with where the line was to sit with what I was writing, and it made it a lot easier to write with humor and all the rest of it, because I just felt quite secure and kind of roughly what people would find funny and all the rest of it. And I've never, I mean, I'm feeling it more now. I've been here, 13 years, but, not to the same extent, not in a very ingrained way. So I think even though my last book was set in Melbourne and didn't have any Scottish characters, if you gave it as a blind test to 20 people from Scotland, they'd probably be like, oh, this seems a bit Scottish. There's something about the humor, the kind of gallows sensibility, all the rest of it.
Yeah, that is really interesting, of course, and not just that you were a journalist in Scotland, but what you were immersing yourself in the culture. You were writing about the culture as well. So I think that often has a strong effect. But you've also been a journalist in Australia, haven't you?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm currently a film journalist, which it certainly isn't hard journalism or anything. But when I first got here, I helped set up a website called The Conversation, which started in Melbourne. Was started by a guy called Andrew Jaspan, actually, who's the ex-editor of the Sunday Herald, editor and creator of the Sunday Herald. And yeah, that was great. It was a website. Well, it exists in the UK now, but pairing academics with journalists to kind of write up to the minute news in a way that traditionally has been harder for academics to do. The kind of classic example being, obviously we've just seen a big and terrible earthquake in Morocco. So you'd be on the phone to a seismologist who might say, oh, I need, a couple of months to look at the data when it all comes out. And as the journalist, you'd say essentially, well, we need to get something out today. How can we work with you to get a story out that's, research based and factual, but is also meeting the kind of demands of the news cycle. So yeah, that was a great project to be involved in, and I was there for years. And
you mentioned earlier that in terms of your novel, you're your own editor. Actually, you're getting it as close to a final piece as you can, and that seems to come from your experience as a journalist. That's what you did. You say you maybe wrote 900 words, got it down to 600 or whatever. Are there other ways in which your work as a journalist feeds into your fiction, or is it all just writing?
I think there are other ways. I was actually, I don't even know why I was thinking about this today. Oh, I do actually. Yeah, I was at a writers' festival this weekend in a place called Albury, so just a couple of days ago. And I went to a session with a writer called Pip Williams, who's written a book called The Dictionary of Lost Words and the Bookbinder of Jericho. And they're runaway successes. Everyone loves them. The room was packed out. And she was asked about her research as a historical novelist, and she talked about her training as a social scientist and how she absolutely loves the research, and she can go really deep into it. And she was picking out all these like amazing facts. The fact that the suffragettes were behind the white feather movement to kind of embarrass young men into signing up for the war. Never knew that. She's telling us it's based on deep research. I think as a journalist, you're way more of a magpie than that. So that's a kind of burrowing into the research and coming back out with the goods. The magpie is much more likely to just swoop those goods out of that person's hand as they bring them to the light. And so it's basically, yeah, the thought I was having was everything on the page needs to be true and correct and kind of you're on solid ground, but there doesn't necessarily need to be much more than that. You know, the tip of the iceberg is all you really need as a journalist. So to go back to the example about the conversation, you know, the reason a seismologist might say they need a couple of months is a very good one to respond to the earthquake in Morocco, that, you know, they really need to wait and see, you know, I don't know the terms, but presumably the Richter scale models and, you know, how the houses were composed and stuff. But what you would do as a journalist, and what journalists around the world would have done last week when that happened, was basically get onto Wikipedia, get onto some other sites, follow up some news wires, and cobble that stuff together in a way that reads as accurate and is hopefully kind of fact checked as much as you can, but it doesn't require the deep dive into the subject. So I think that's definitely a skill from journalism. That how do you turn around something that reads as solid when you don't actually have that solid or that deep an expertise, because you're a Jack or a Jill of all trades. You're never, unless you're, you know, the ingrained kind of court reporter or crime reporter or whatever, you're not really going to have a huge depth of experience to draw on for most stories.
That's an interesting idea, though, that the tip of the iceberg and you've got this huge body underneath. And in terms of novels, is that kind of similar? It's what you want the reader to read is the result of all this research and work and all the things that you've done to make sure that what they read, that bit at the top, is true and understanding, and all of those things can be understood, rather.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. You know, one of the other things that I think, just from writing for a while, that has become apparent is you actually need to do less work in terms of character development on the page, I mean, than you would think. You need to give less rather than more quite often. And you see it, like with anything, like with any art form, films being a good example, you usually see it, and it becomes more obvious in the negative. So if you watch a film or read a book where you feel everything is being explained to you, or you're being, like your hand has been taken and you're like, now look at this, now feel that, now respond this way. You know when it's there and it's heavy-handed. You don't necessarily know when it's there and it's just kind of in the middle somewhere, but you kind of, you don't see the positives. The opposite of that is when you're just racing through a book and ideas are fizzing away in your head. And I think a lot of that comes down to not overdoing it as the writer, which goes back to what we were saying at the start. Really, it's almost like the hardest lesson to learn. It's that it's not necessarily about jumping up and down. You know, it's not doing star jumps and saying, look over here. It's actually like, how do I, you know, that when a camera is moving backwards, how do they get all those wires out of the way? You want to be getting the wires out of the way so that the people at home don't see the light and the boom mic and all the rest of it, you know, and just give people an experience that they can go through. It's their experience. It's not really yours by the time they're reading it.
And this idea of telling the truth in your novel, it made me think about unreliable narrators. And if Margaret herself is unreliable in that her being disembodied, for want of a better term, does that add a layer? Because she's not sure. She's reassessing events as we readers are reassessing events as we go along. Is that something that you thought about her, that she's kind of learning anew?
Yeah. So Margaret's an unreliable narrator, but what I honestly believe, Alistair, is that we're all unreliable narrators. So there's this, I guess there's various versions of this bit of research, but that what we think of as true memories are memories of, like, the first memory we had of it, and then the next story we told about it, etc. So there are all these, you know, the repertoire of stories when we meet somebody new and we say, oh, you know, there was this time that I met this person or did that. They actually, but because we're responding to the memories, to the previous telling of it, over time, I mean, there's no way to prove this, of course, but I imagine if we went back to the original thing, we would realize that it's actually quite different to what actually happened. And so Margaret's finding herself with that kind of disconnect. She's gone back and she kind of remembers that, oh, this was probably that time we went to this place. But she is kind of startled and seeing it anew because it wouldn't correspond to your memories. Again, sorry to keep using film analogies, but it's like that thing in a film where, you know, they're in a dream sequence and, you know, we see them and they're walking around and everything's really, you know, clear. Like I don't know about you, but I don't dream like that. I'm not like looking at myself walking through. So there are all these conventions and how we retell stories to ourselves and to others that aren't quite right. I think we're all unreliable narrators. Like I think the more suspect idea in a way artistically is that somebody would present a reliable narrator. It's that, oh, who is that person? Because they seem to be outside of human reality or something.
But what I thought here, what was interesting is you have the different characters, like for instance, her husband or her daughters, and they would have their own points of view. Even Margaret herself, alive, of what's unfolding, of what this memory means to them and all that. But then you've got the other Margaret who's viewing it all, sometimes for the first time, or at least seeing it with new eyes.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, without kind of, I guess, trying to avoid a spoiler, I mean, as you'll know, because you've read the book, but, you know, Margaret increasingly starts to have a sense that she's missing quite a big part of the puzzle. And the question for her is she deliberately forgetting something, or has she accidentally forgotten something? Like, she knows she's really angry with her husband. She kind of has little outbursts at him and can be quite insulting about him at times, but she doesn't quite know why. And she says at one point she can't forgive him because she can't remember what he might have done or something he might have been involved in. And there's a few bits like that as the book goes on that she is very openly, I guess, questioning whether she has the wrong end of the stick, which in a way, like to go back to the earlier part of the discussion, is another reason why the timelines, just from a creating the story point of view, why they are jumping around, because I wanted both Margaret and the reader to be slightly disoriented as to the chronology of things and what was happening and why they might have been angry in this bit and not in that bit, etc.
And that kind of goes back to this idea of examining grief, because I think grief and memory together, that's something else again, isn't it? You know, the things that you remember, the way you want to remember them, and all of those things are intertwined.
Yeah, no, I think they are. They're kind of inseparable. They're all smushed up, basically. Yeah.
So this is your third novel, as you said. The other two, are they forgotten? Is it moving on rather than ever going back to them?
Well, the first one was actually a memoir, so it was about my first year in Australia, and yeah, the fact that I had a kid here. My wife was 36 weeks pregnant when we moved, and we had a 1-year-old. So it was about that first year and fatherhood, really reflecting on my own role as a new dad and my own dad, that relationship too. So the rights for that one came back to me. I've got an agent, and he loved that book too. And we're always like, God, why can't we do something with that? Or maybe we can one day. The other novel, Polly, is still kind of out in the market, as it were, here. So we'll see what happens with that one. But there's only so much you can do, you know, as the writer, other than, you know, write a begging letter to the publisher saying, please republish this one. And it's actually only the first one I've got the rights back for. The second one still does, you know, it is the property of another publisher at the moment. So yeah, I think go forward is the trick. Otherwise I'll just be chasing my tail forever, I think.
And in terms of going forward, have you even considered, are you working on something you can tell us about, or is it still all about this novel at the moment?
Yeah, so I've written actually quite a lot of something else that I don't want to jinx too much, because I gave a kind of outline of it to somebody a couple of weeks ago and then felt really flat afterwards. You know, it's kind of that, you know, like when you have a dream and you were really excited about it and you wake up and somebody's like, well, that doesn't make sense. You're like, oh. So I won't go too much into it, other than to say it's kind of it's about a couple of characters between the ages of 13 and 14, so young people going through their first kind of big change towards young adulthood. But yeah, I've written quite a bit, and we'll keep going with that one for now and see where it gets to.
And do you have any advice to anyone who, not anyone who wants to be a writer, but maybe people who are writers but they can't get published? That's the step that a lot of people find really difficult. Is there anything that you would suggest to them?
Yeah, I mean, it would obviously, I guess, depend on the individual as to, you know, why they might be getting rejected. I mean, I've definitely had more rejections than acceptances, and my agent, you know, bless him, for better or worse, just copies and pastes what the rejection letters say to him, rather than breaking it to me easy with, oh, you know, it wasn't quite right for them. It's like, shit, you don't need to tell me that they actually like hated my thing. So I've certainly had plenty of rejections, like so many. But ultimately, as my agent had said to me, and as is fairly obvious, you only need one person to publish it. And quite often what you'll see is people can end up with, say, one of the big 5 publishers, and they think they've kind of got it made. It's like, oh, great, I'm with Simon & Schuster or Hachette or whatever. But that's not necessarily the case. You know, the smaller, more independent publishers have a huge advantage for you as a writer, in that they're only going to take on work they really love, and they'll only take on stuff they're really going to push, because they're not publishing 300 books a year. They're publishing 12 or 15 or whatever. So I think it's definitely worth anybody just whatever you're writing, however, you know, outlandish or not outlandish it is, there will be a publisher that is kind of in your wheelhouse or in your bailiwick, and they're who to think about. You know, it might never be that you get published by Penguin. You know, I'll probably never be published by Penguin, I would imagine, but that's not in any way the end of the world. It's much better to be published by a smaller publisher who actually loves your book, by anybody that loves your book, rather than you know, a bigger publisher who are like, okay, that's number 299 off the list for this year, and you know, there's 3 Instagram posts, a tweet, it's in our newsletter, and then, you know, we forget about it forever. So that would be the main thing. And the other I guess kind of genuine bit of advice I would give is a bit like I mentioned in my own case before. You know, if you think a publisher is going to want 80,000 words, send them 80,000 words. Don't you know, most publishers are really busy. Edits on books could be literally like a freelance editor getting paid not very much has a week to do copy edits. They don't want to be reading your book and then going back and forth with you for months. You know, it's not the 1950s in New York. They're not going to be inviting you in for discussions about, you know, little nuances in your book. So if somebody wants 70,000, give them 70,000. You know, I think the sweet spot for anything kind of commercial or literary at the moment is about I think it's anywhere between like 65 and 80,000 words. Just keep it within that. You've already solved a massive problem for the publisher, which is we've got to cut this thing in half, and you know, the author is going to be pissed off and blah blah blah. And yeah, just yeah, that would be kind of my main one. And seem I don't know why I'm suddenly full of so much advice, but another one that just came to mind is people need to be able to talk about your idea to lots of other people. So if you get a publisher interested, they've then got to go and talk to like people in marketing and blah blah blah. So that thing that, you know, I do and everyone does at a party, or when you asked me a minute ago, what are you working on now? And you're like, it's and 13-year-old and blah blah blah. It doesn't really travel well in terms of a little thing that people can pass on. So you want to try and not do a kind of bells and whistles like blurb line for it, but actually make it quite simple. You know, say it's like a natural ghost story set in Scotland, etc. And that's like, okay, somebody can then take that, and move it on to the next person, and they can discuss it as an idea. Yes, your book's got millions more things to it, and ideas and hopes and dreams and all the rest of it. But fundamentally, what is it as a product? If you can nail that in a very straightforward, non-glamorous way, you're giving the publisher, you're solving another problem for the publisher.
Come back to films, it's that snakes on a plane idea. It's, you know, that
exactly
line, yeah.
Exactly that, yeah.
Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and all the very best with the novel as well.
Oh, thanks, Alistair. It's been a real pleasure talking to you too. Great discussion. Thank you.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.